Welcome to the deep dive. Have you ever, really pondered what fascism actually meant beyond the usual headlines? Especially when you look at it through specific national lens, like Britain.
Right. Our minds often jump to certain images, don't they?
They do. But what if we could sort of peel back those layers and look at a really detailed blueprint, a plan for an entire society, exactly as the people pushing for it imagined it back at a specific moment in time?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing today.
Today, we're diving deep into this really remarkable document from 1938. It lays out the complete vision for a British corporate state.
And our source material, it's genuinely exceptional for this deep dive. We're looking at excerpts from a 1938 document literally titled Coming Corporate State, British Fascism.
So not a history book about it, but the thing itself.
Exactly. It's not someone else's analysis or interpretation from later on. It's a direct explanation from the movement itself, outlining their whole proposed government, economy, society, the lot. It really is a rare, unfiltered glimpse into a very specific, very comprehensive ideology. And it was presented back then as the plan for Britain's future.
Okay, so our mission today is clear. It's not about endorsing or condemning anything here. It's really just about trying to understand.
Right. Setting aside political leanings.
Absolutely. It's about getting informed quickly but thoroughly. We're going to pull out the most important nuggets of insight from this foundational text. The idea is you can get properly well-informed on a topic that, let's face it, often stays pretty hazy for most people.
Yeah, it does.
We're basically stepping back into 1938, trying to see the world through the eyes of the people who wrote this compelling document.
And what really jumps out when you read it is just the sheer scope. It's way more than just a political manifesto.
Right.
It gets into the nitty-gritty of how industries would be organized, how they'd be governed, the details of banking, foreign trade. It even covers things like art, leisure, and the role of the crown in this new setup.
An entire societal blueprint.
That's what it is. And its supporters presented it as the raw truth for Britain, designed to fix what they saw as the fundamental problems with the system they had.
Okay, so given this really ambitious vision, the big question has to be, why? Why did they think, according to this text, that such a drastic, revolution was necessary in the first place?
Yeah, good starting point.
Let's start there. What was their diagnosis of the problems Britain faced in 1938? What was the argument for needing this massive change?
The why, diagnosing democracy's failure and the promise of the corporate state.
Well, the document kicks off with a pretty stark claim. Democracy is failing all over the world. Just lays it out there.
No mincing words?
Not at all. And it blames this failure mainly on what it calls a mistaken belief in absolute individual liberty.
Okay, so too much freedom is the problem.
That's the core argument. They say this unchecked individual freedom has negatived all effective government, and kind of ironically, actually deprive the people of their essential freedom.
How so? How does too much liberty deprive people of freedom in their view?
Because, for them, unrestrained liberty just led to chaos. It stopped society working for the collective good, which in turn, they argued, limited real, practical freedom for ordinary people.
Right, and what's really interesting is how the document tries to link this supposed failure to actual historical events. It points fingers particularly at the liberals repealing the Corn Laws and Navigation Acts back in the last century.
Yeah, that's a key historical anchor for them.
The argument seems to be that, okay, people got political self-government, but at the same time, economic and financial control slipped away.
Slipped into the hands of, and this is their phrase, a few irresponsible individuals who then exploited their liberty at everyone else's expense.
So political freedom without economic control was basically useless, an illusion.
Exactly. The text frames it as a massive betrayal of democratic self-government. It tries to illustrate this by pointing out how again and again since the First World War, political parties made all these promises.
Social improvements, fixing unemployment.
Right. All that. But then, when in office, have been unable to carry out their pledges. The document insists it's not just bad politicians, no. It's the system which is at fault.
So the system itself prevents good intentions from working.
That's the claim. It says, with the best will, none of the old parties can hope to improve our economic distress, so long as they uphold the perverted tenets of individual liberty, which deny them the power to rule, and condemn the bulk of the people to economic enslavement.
Wow, economic enslavement. That's strong language. And that leads them to their radical solution then.
It does. The British Union, which the text often calls the black shirts, demands the corporate state as the only means of effective economic government. Without it, they claim, all self-government can be no more than an illusion.
It's a pretty complete dismissal of the whole existing political scene, isn't it? Saying it just can't deliver.
Totally. The document is explicit. They say they won't be satisfied with just the pomp and ceremony of parliamentary procedure or the, uniforms and emoluments of high political office.
They want the real levers of power.
Exactly. They demand power to govern. Power not merely to act as figureheads run by civil servants, but power to control and direct industrial and financial organization. The goal was for the official government to be the real government.
Empowered to actually do things.
Right, empowered to fulfill the wishes of the people, solve the big problems like slums and unemployment by basically unleashing the productive powers of the nation to lift everyone's standard of living.
And they position this corporate state as the ultimate fix for the chaos and disorder of the present economic system. And there's that direct quote you mentioned, highlighting a recurring theme.
Yes, that it's designed to break the hidden dictatorship of vested interests and alien financiers who exploit present conditions for their own benefit.
That idea of unseen forces pulling the strings seems really central to their whole argument.
It is.
Yeah.
And to really get their proposed solution, you need to grasp its three parts. First, they present it as a philosophic conception. The nation is seen as an organism of a higher order, transcending the individuals within it.
Almost a spiritual view of the nation.
You could say that. It's foundational. Second, it's an economic organization. Industry gets planned and developed along functional service lines. Efficiency, collective purpose. That's the aim.
And third?
Third, it's a social order. This is designed to maintain the family unit, but also allow freedom of self-expression and initiative within the multitude of reproductive family units. So it really is a total blueprint for society, not just an economic fix.
And they have a specific order for putting this all in place, don't they? Authority, prosperity, freedom.
Exactly. Authority comes first. That's the tool to keep the state together as a social entity. Then prosperity, achieved through this functional organization of the economy. And finally, freedom. But freedom, the text says, is something the individual realizes only after they've been freed from political corruption and economic hardship.
So freedom is the result, not the starting point.
Precisely. And this ordering, they say, differs materially from that of democracy. Fascism, according to this text, does recognize individual freedom, but it doesn't put it before all others, as does decayed democracy.
Because individual freedom can only follow economic liberation, in their view.
That's what they explicitly assert. They argue that liberty, adopted as an overriding principle, must inevitably generate into the capitalist system, or usuriocracy.
Usuriocracy.
Yeah, it basically means a system dominated and exploited by financial power, by lending for profit. And this really raises a key question for us, doesn't it? What does it actually mean to think of freedom as a consequence of state-imposed order and economic security, rather than a fundamental inherent right? It completely flips the usual liberal understanding.
It really does. So how did the British Union plan to actually achieve this? What were the steps?
Three clear steps once they got power. First, establish central authority by an enabling bill, empowering the government to rule by order in council. So immediate concentration of power.
Step one, take control.
Right. Step two, the government will establish prosperity by planning both production and distribution. Economic planning kicks in.
And step three?
Step three, with authority and prosperity supposedly secured, the individual will gain for the first time that economic freedom which he has been denied by the liberal capitalist system security of work and wages, home and happiness, life and leisure. The text talks about creating a healthy correlation between the individual, their functional group, and the nation.
And they make it clear which aspect gets tackled first.
Yes, very clear. Of the three aspects, political, economic, cultural, current, the economic one comes first. That's where the most drastic changes must be made.
Which makes sense given their diagnosis that economic chaos was the root of all the problems. Material well-being first, then everything else follows.
The economic blueprint corporations and centralized control.
Exactly.
Okay, so with the why laid out, let's dive into the core mechanism of this new constitutional form, the corporate state's economic structure. It all kicks off with something called the corporations. How do they picture these actually working?
Right. This is where their vision really breaks from traditional government. The corporate state is fundamentally built on industrial or occupational organization rather than the regional or geographical method of government used today.
So your job defines your political unit, not where you live.
Pretty much. The text explicitly says this vocational basis runs through the whole system, both of government and representation. It's foundational. Instead of an MP representing, say, Manchester, they'd represent the textile industry or engineering or whatever.
So we're talking about governance by industry, effectively.
Precisely. The document says the corporate state endows industries and occupations with new powers of self-government.
Self-government, like little industry parliaments.
Kind of. These powers are exercised much like local authorities operate today, able to pass bylaws binding upon the industry as a whole. And this is a huge shift because, as the text points out, previous attempts at industrial planning often have broken down because of the difficulty of compelling an industry to fulfill agreements.
Ah, so these decisions would have legal teeth.
Exactly. Under this corporate system, decisions made by a corporation would be legally binding, and any breach will be punishable at law. Compliance is built in.
And the document actually lists these proposed corporations, doesn't it? That list really shows the scale of their thinking.
It does. It's sweeping. Covers everything from primary products and then agriculture, mining, to industrial sectors like engineering and textiles, right through to distributive services, transport, retail.
And even includes things you might not expect, like banking, insurance, domestic workers, even pensioners.
Yes. What's really striking is how they imagined every single part of economic life, from the biggest factory down to the individual household, being brought into this corporatist structure. It just shows how all-encompassing their ambition was.
And how would representation work within each of these corporations? You mentioned it wasn't meant to be adversarial.
Right. It was structured, they claimed, to foster collaboration between the various industrial factors, not by their mutual hostility, as supposed by the Manchester School of Economists, classical free market thinking.
So, collaboration, not conflict. How?
Each corporation would represent three groups: employers, workers, and consumers. And crucially, with equal representation and equal power. That means no single group could be outvoted by the other two.
Equal representation. That's interesting. How would that actually work? Who gets elected by whom?
Okay, let's break it down quickly. Employers' representatives. They'd be elected by the owners, partners, directors, managers, executives within that industry. And every business would have to join an employers' federation.
Compulsory membership.
Yes. Then, workers' representatives. Elected by all employees except managers. They'd form a trade union, embracing every worker but confined entirely to these. So the principle of trade unionism is entirely retained and advanced to 100%. But, and this is key, it would be stripped of their obnoxious and irrelevant political activities.
Ah, so unions exist, but only for workplace issues, not wider politics. What about consumers? They're harder to organize.
Yeah, the document admits that. You can't really elect consumer representatives easily. So the government, acting as representative of the nation, would nominate reputable persons to represent the general consumer interest.
Nominated, not elected.
Right. And for cases where one industry consumes another's products, like steel using coal representatives, would be nominated by the corporations controlling those specific industries. The whole point, the text emphasizes, is to give all members of every industry a direct share in the control of the great economic factors of their daily life. They'd determine their own conditions of their daily work, their remuneration for their service, and the planning and regulation of their own trade or profession.
Okay, so you have all these individual corporations, each supposedly self-governing. But how do you stop them just becoming battlegrounds for industrial conflict? Or, as the text itself worries about, exploiting the community? What keeps them in line? What's the central control?
That's a critical question, and they do address it. The document actually says the system closely resembles syndicalism, the idea of worker control of industries, but it explicitly flags syndicalism's weakness: insufficient allowance for central government.
So they saw that potential problem.
Yes. And their solution. The corporate state may be defined as a syndicalist system upon which has been superimposed a powerful central government. Those consumer representatives we mentioned are key here. They act as a check and control, warning about unfair price hikes or output restrictions. They're basically delegates of central authority embedded within each corporation.
So it's not just a loose collection of industries doing their own thing. There's an overarching body coordinating it all.
Absolutely. This central control is embodied in the national corporation. It's described as a general economic council with representatives from every individual corporation. Its explicit job is to centralize the administration of the whole system, coordinating everything in the interests of the national welfare. And membership would be weighted by how important each industry was.
And its function is described as executive and administrative, not legislative like the House of Commons.
Yeah.
So it's not making laws, but it's settling disputes, acting like a judge for industry.
Yes, it has that judicial capacity for settling disputes within and between corporations, but it also has a much, much bigger job.
Which is?
The task of industrial planning on a national scale will be vested in the national corporation. It's responsible for balancing consumption to production by its control over wage rates throughout the country. Imagine that. It's supposed to have the best executive brains of industrial and professional life advising the Minister of Corporations.
Wow, controlling wage rates nationally to balance the economy. And the document specifically mentions the huge issue of the time, overproduction and unemployment. How does the corporate state plan to fix that?
The text says that's the first task of the national corporation solving this economic quandary. It flat out rejects the idea that unemployment is just an inevitable result of rationalization or new technology, calls those views modern defeatists. They believed man could master technology for the common good.
And they use that analogy, right? The Pacific Islanders?
Yes, it's quite vivid. Imagine 20 families working 8 hours a day to feed themselves with basic tools. Then they get a plow, and suddenly only 15 families are needed. What happens to the other 5?
Under the current system, they'd be unemployed.
Right, which the text calls the way of Western civilization. But even the most primitive savages, the text claims, would figure out that by a readjustment of the hours of work to 6 a day instead of 8, all would have employment and would enjoy more leisure.
So the point of the analogy is that the problem of rationalization is a problem of organization.
Yeah.
Technology isn't the enemy. It's how you manage its benefits.
That's their core claim. Modern science can bring greater wealth or greater leisure, or a sane combination of both. And the planned state would achieve this mainly through largely financial methods.
Right.
Higher wages and salaries and putting a larger volume of currency and credit into free circulation. This means ditching the gold standard, setting up a managed currency. And they claim there's no real danger of inflation in a planned and disciplined state.
A big claim.
Huge. The document basically promises the corporate state will release the full powers of modern production for the benefit of all sections and gives an absolute guarantee that the problem of unemployment will be finally and permanently solved. You can see how appealing that would sound in the depths of the 1930s depression.
Absolutely. So going back to the individual corporations, beyond just having a say in governance, what are their actual day-to-day duties? What's their job description once they're set up?
The document neatly divides their duties into 3 types: regulative, planning, and social. Let's take the regulative function first. Its main goal is to stop the conflict between employers and workers, the opposing armies as they call them, no more threatening each other with destructive antisocial weapons of the strike and lockout.
So strikes and lockouts are just banned.
Outlawed. Neither can be tolerated in this planned state. Instead, the national corporation makes each industrial corporation draw up legally binding codes of wages, hours, and conditions of work.
And if they can't agree,
the consumer representatives step in as mediators. If that fails, the national corporation intervenes, and the final backstop is a labor court for compulsory arbitration.
and what about prices and competition between businesses? Also regulated.
Yes, those issues are also meant to be settled by mutual agreement within the corporation. Again, the consumer reps are crucial. They're there to stop employers and workers ganging up to restrict production and extort unreasonable profits and wages. They can appeal to the national corporation if needed.
Even dividends, the return on capital.
Even that, the return upon invested capital in the form of dividends would be regulated. A national investment board would publish a guiding figure for a fair return on secure investments just to keep things stable.
Okay, that's the regulating part. What about the planning function? How do they guide the industry's future growth, contraction?
The corporations themselves decide whether their industry needs to expand or contract based on demand. If they want to expand, they apply to this investment board for capital, which actively encourages new businesses. Worker reps sort out getting trained labor. Consumer reps advise on marketing. It implies this new partnership where workers and consumers plan alongside employers.
And if an industry is declining, maybe because of new technology?
Then contraction is managed with the minimum of hardship. Obsolete factories, redundant plant, get closed down, the owners get compensated, and the displaced workers get retrained by the government and moved to other expanding industries that need people.
A managed transition then. And the third function, social. What does that involve?
Here, the document looks to examples from Italy, the Dopolavoro, or after-work recreation schemes, and Germany's Strength Through Joy program.
So organizing leisure time.
Yes, it proposes coordinating and expanding existing companies' sport clubs, libraries, social clubs into a general system for everyone in the industry, promoting fitness and social life. It also mentions better industrial insurance and pensions, superannuation, that wouldn't be lost if you changed jobs, unlike some private schemes back then.
And the overall justification for this whole structure.
The text argues it's the only means of realizing the advantages of such a system without the destructive antisocial features of the class war, which are so repugnant to all fair-minded Englishmen. Collaboration over conflict, basically.
This detailed structure leads us into a really, well, fascinating and, let's be honest, controversial area. Their concept of economic justice. It starts with a pretty harsh critique of the existing legal system.
Yeah, it claims the legal system is biased in favor of the owner of property and acts as a bulwark erected by bourgeois society to protect the interests of those who have.
Strong stuff. So what do they demand instead?
They demand economic justice. Justice as between the various factors of industry. It slams what it calls financial democracy for having low morals, describing business competition as basically eat or be eaten. This really brings up the question of their underlying views on human nature and economics, doesn't it?
It does. And then there's that particularly stark and deeply problematic claim. We should stress we're reporting directly from the source here.
Yes, absolutely. It's crucial to be clear about that. The text claims Darwinian survival in the realm of nature may have tended to improve the species. Economic survival in the realm of commerce seems to degenerate the race. And then it adds, the predominance of Jews is not surprising. They possess the attributes suitable to survival under these conditions.
That's a direct quote.
A direct quote from the 1938 source. It reflects a deeply troubling and anti-Semitic viewpoint prevalent in some circles at the time, and we include it solely because it's part of the historical document's content. We're not endorsing it in any way.
Understood. So, moving beyond that specific ugly point, how would this corporate justice fundamentally change property rights? It's not just about protecting ownership anymore.
No, it goes much further. Corporate justice, the text says, would lay down the conditions under which property may be owned. It states, flat out, a man may by no means do what he likes with his own. Owning wealth comes with a grave responsibility that that wealth is used to the public benefit.
That's a massive shift from the liberal idea that pursuing self-interest automatically helps everyone.
A complete rejection of it. The document dismisses that idea as liberal atavism, like a throwback to a primitive state. They were explicitly advocating for the laws of man to replace what they saw as the laws of the jungle in the economy.
So if the corporate state is about this kind of economic justice, what happens to things like strikes, which are banned, and competition itself?
Well, as we said, strikes and lockouts are prohibited. They're seen as crude resorts to force where justice should hold sway. The analogy they use is, if you can't use force in a property dispute, why should you be allowed to in a wage dispute?
So workers would sue their employers instead.
Yes, sue offending employers in special courts using ordinary legal means. Similarly, prices and the terms of competition are negotiated within the corporation. No industry can just force up prices beyond what is a fair return. And undercutting rivals or engaging in unfair competition actually becomes an offense you could be arraigned before an industrial court for.
So justice extends beyond wages to fair business practices, too.
And even further, the Code of Economic Justice covers social insurance, child welfare, superannuation. It's about safeguarding individuals against economic mishap, making sure an honest workman, dismissed through no fault of his own, doesn't just sink lower and lower in the social scale of despair and misery.
Okay, let's switch gears slightly to foreign trade. The document tackles a concern that actually sounds quite modern, doesn't it? The fear that paying higher wages at home might make exports too expensive and mess up the balance of trade.
It does address that head-on, and it basically dismisses the fear. It argues, look, other countries are already trying to make their own stuff anyway, so British export trade is falling regardless.
So don't chase exports, focus inwards.
That's the solution presented. Turn Britain's productive capacity to our own benefit instead of to the enrichment of international financiers. How? By raising purchasing power and living standards at home, and this is crucial within the British Empire, the imperial dominions.
The empire as a self-contained economic unit.
Very much so. It leans heavily on the empire for raw materials and food, even citing Lord Beaverbrook's view that relying on foreign sources is either negligible or could be made temporary.
And how does this translate into bargaining power with other countries outside the empire?
The claim is the corporate state gives Britain bargaining power never before realized. Why? Because of Britain's huge buying power over 40 million consumers, the core principle becomes Britain buys from those who buy from Britain, and they insist this will be no empty political slogan, but will be effectively enforced.
How enforced?
Through a foreign trade board set up by the National Corporation. This board regulates all foreign trade. Importers can't just buy from anywhere anymore. They must place orders with countries that provide a market for British exports. The goal is effectively balanced trade based not upon maximal exports, but upon minimal imports.
Minimal imports. And they weren't worried foreign suppliers would just refuse to sell under those conditions.
Apparently not. The text expresses confidence, arguing foreign producers are suffering from overproduction themselves and would rather sell something to Britain, even if it means buying British goods in return, than just burn them or dump them in the sea. It's all about using economic muscle to enforce respect on world markets.
Another major target in this document is what it calls the hidden dictatorship of finance, operating from the City of London, blamed for a lot of the economic decline. What was their plan to deal with the city?
This gets to the heart of controlling capital, doesn't it? The text accuses the great financial houses of the city of basically neglecting Britain, of directing immense resources into foreign investment detrimental to the interests of our own industries.
And there's that recurring mention of aliens again.
Yes, it specifies many of alien origin taking advantage of freedom to export capital, which, they claim, starved British industry of funds. The corporate state's aim was to break this perceived financial tyranny.
How exactly? What's the mechanism?
They propose setting up an investment board to control and regulate all future flotations, meaning new issues of stocks and shares. Its members would be trusted government officials, representatives of banking and insurance, and the Patents Office.
And its job.
To review every single new flotation or application for credit. It would issue a license, and without that license, appealing or public investment would be illegal. And crucially, all further foreign lending without special sanction will be prohibited. Britain, the document says, has wasted enough money in that direction, often funding future competitors abroad.
So, tight control over money leaving the country. What about money within the country?
That too. Even domestic investments would need a license. And the board wouldn't just check financial reliability. It would also ask if the investment is in the public interest, consulting the relevant industrial corporation.
Going even further, regulating saving itself.
Yes. Another duty was controlling the volume of saving in the community for future investment. They actually argued current saving was excessive. Why? Because of personal insecurity, people saving for a rainy day, and the excessive reward extorted by capital. The board would manage saving and spending according to the needs of the nation and its resources.
And tackling usury.
Right. Usury in the form of a fixed rate of interest on loans and debentures without risk will be discouraged. The aim was to lift the load of debt upon nation and industry. Loan capital would be repaid, sure, but it would no longer permitted to accumulate an interest charge which is entirely unearned by service.
And this board also had a role in developing the empire.
Yes, participating in the planned development of imperial resources, linking investment directly to emigration of British labor into the dominion in question, to provide workers for the new projects funded by British capital.
Okay, moving to a very specific grievance raised in the document. The supposedly scandalous treatment of British inventors, often driven abroad, it claims, because they couldn't get funding. Why did the text think this was happening?
It points to what it sees as grave defects in our system. First, apart from the Patent Office, there was no official body of trained technicians and scientists to decide on the value and practicability of the invention, no proper vetting system. Second, the banks get criticized again, called mere bureaucratic moneylenders on security, unwilling to take a risk on unproven inventions. Third, support for inventions usually only kicked in once they were already a practical, marketable proposition, not during the crucial early experimental stage. And inventors themselves are portrayed as often both poor and unbusinesslike, making them vulnerable.
Vulnerable to exploitation.
Yes, at the mercy of private financiers or big industrial companies, combines, who could strike most unfair bargains, leaving the inventor with practically nothing.
And there's even an accusation, isn't there, that some useful inventions were deliberately held back.
A serious accusation. The document claims inventions have been used merely as instruments for the extortion of vast sums from vested interests which would suffer from their development. Big companies are accused of buying up and suppressing many patents that could have benefited the nation but would have made their existing large stocks of goods and machinery out of date. It says, quite bluntly, scarcely any body of men have suffered so severely from corruption as have inventors.
So what was their proposed solution for inventors?
A two-part plan. First, establish a board of scientific research, linked to the Patents Office, to investigate and advise on new inventions. Second, use the investment board we just talked about to actually fund inventions, right, from the experimental stage to the point where a public company could be floated.
Giving them help much earlier on.
Exactly, giving inventors direct assistance at a much earlier stage and freeing them from dependence on those financiers, although private investment wasn't ruled out entirely.
All right, let's circle back to finance more broadly then. The document argues that this idea of functional responsibility, that every occupation has a duty to society, has broken down most obviously in finance. What exactly do they mean by that?
It really gets back to the fundamental purpose of money. The text makes this comparison. A manufacturer knows shoes are for wearing, right? But purveyors of money have apparently no thought for the use of money, but only for its negotiation. They've forgotten its real job.
Which is?
Its sole function, according to the text, is to facilitate the exchange of goods and services and thus to distribute production. Simple as that. But bankers, it criticizes, prioritize the security of his depositors and the profits of his shareholders over the actual development of industry.
Seeing money as separate from the real economy.
Exactly. Thinking of money as a thing apart. And the text accuses them of actually thriving during the Depression by enforcing a drastic restriction of money and credit, which has strangled industry and trade.
So another direct attack on how banking worked then. What was the British Union's goal for finance?
To bring banking and finance back to a proper concept of a functional responsibility towards the community as a whole. Monetary policy must ensure there's adequate money and credit to finance the exchange of goods and services. To fix the situation where you have warehouses and stores choked with goods, millions of men and women offering their services without response.
That mismatch of supply and demand.
Yes. The document promises to break this artificial stringency and release sufficient money and credit to assure the sale of unsold goods and the employment of unused services. It even gives a nod to famous credit reformers as Major Douglas, who promoted social credit ideas.
And again, tackling that fear of inflation if you just print more money or issue more credit.
Right. The text acknowledges the fear. It says, under democracy, it would probably lead to inflation. But, they claim, a planned and disciplined state under British Union could handle it. It would transfer the stability to the economic structure as a whole, because they plan the whole economic system, brings it under scientific control, and renders it immune to depression and panic.
And they weren't planning to nationalize the banks.
Interestingly, no. British Union does not contemplate nationalization. Instead, they'd place banking, finance, and insurance under a financial corporation which would be responsible to the government. This corporation directs policy, putting the national interests before personal or sectional interests. That's how they'd solve the problem of financing both consumption and new industrial development.
And that specific point about the gold standard again.
Yes, very specific. Present money issues are inadequate for financing the high standard of life rendered possible by modern scientific and technical accomplishment, so British Union government would break any connection with gold and base currency upon a commodity basis. The Bank of England would be brought under strict state control to issue this new currency in accordance with productive capacity.
And the rationale for this strict government control over finance.
To prevent monetary affairs falling back into the hands of what they call a selfish and irresponsible minority, largely alien or bound up in alien interests, which at present dictates financial policy. Money power, the text insists, must be in the hands of clean and responsible government.
Okay, all this focus on economic justice and making different parts of the economy serve the nation brings us to maybe the most detailed section on workers, the Charter of Labor. The goal, it says, is a balanced system of cooperation to replace the current conflicts.
It's a very powerful statement of what they wanted to achieve. It calls for completely getting rid of liberalism with its hideous doctrines of greed and self-interest, poorly disguised as liberty, equality, and fraternity.
Replacing them with
cooperation, service, and patriotism, making sure no citizen may permanently enrich himself to the detriment of the nation. The text aims to unite workers, small traders, even honest producers against the perceived tyranny of high finance, arguing employers and workers actually have common interests.
And it uses that striking analogy.
The lion analogy, yes. We must make it clear that we have trimmed the capitalist lion's claws and pulled his financial teeth. The class war, they argue, can only be ended by a treaty of peace, and British Union would be the mediator to achieve that.
And this Charter of Labor itself is incredibly specific about the protections and new structures it would create. Let's maybe run through some of the main points.
Absolutely. It starts with a philosophic principle, emphasizing the united corporate nation where everyone, employer and worker alike, owes a duty of service and gets an assured and just reward in return.
And it gets into organizations and negotiations.
Right. Establishing employers and workers' organizations with full power to negotiate national wage and hours agreements for each industry. That's the 100% trade unionism idea, but again, stripped of political activity. It also mandates judiciary bodies to settle disputes, which allows for the consequent abolition of all strikes and lockouts, using judges helped by industry experts, trade assessors.
And the specific list of worker safeguards is quite long and detailed.
It really is. The Charter insists on compulsory weekly and yearly paid holidays, compulsory overtime pay and limited standard hours, regulating piecework rates so an average worker can earn at least standard wages, election and recognition of shop stewards in larger workplaces, compensation for long-serving workers if dismissed or upon death before retirement, equal pay for men and women doing similar work, and importantly, no dismissal just for getting married.
Also specific provisions for mothers.
Yes, holiday on full pay for mothers when a child is born. And finally, workers' wage claims get preference if a company goes bankrupt.
Beyond those individual protections, there's also a section on joint organization by employers and workers doing things together.
Right. This covers things like special labor exchanges run by the unions for each industry, craft training to improve quality and efficiency, pension schemes, superannuation based on the status you reach, like civil service pensions, pooling all the company recreation schemes and developing them through the corporation, educational and holiday schemes, especially for young people working in unpleasant conditions, and housing schemes linked to where jobs are, especially in new industrial areas.
And finally, state-run insurance.
Yes, state-conducted insurance for unemployment and health. Benefits would depend on your status in industry. Crucially, no means test. The only reason you'd be disqualified is refusing work at trade union rates, and there'd be no time limit for benefit. Plus, a special national medical service focused on industrial diseases with generous compensation.
And the document makes a point of not mentioning the minimum wage.
It does. It calls the minimum wage, so beloved of class war socialists, just a defensive weapon against exploitation, which wouldn't be needed anymore in the corporate state. Instead, workers would supposedly enjoy full partnership in industry, taking their full share of profits in the form of advancing wage rates.
And what happens to things like unions restricting output, often a source of conflict?
Those trade union restrictions upon production would be removed. Why? Because they're seen as defensive measures that become absurd once the unemployment problem is solved. If workers are true partners, the text argues, they'll realize efficient production is in his own interest, and they'll naturally use every endeavor to increase output and prevent waste.
So the claim is this whole package transforms adversaries into partners, solving the root causes of conflict.
The political structure reimagining governance?
That's the core idea, yes.
Okay, so we've explored this massive plan to rebuild the economy, but that kind of radical economic change needs an equally revolutionary political system to support it. The document pulls no punches, saying democracy has proved a complete failure even in politics. So what's their alternative to the democratic system we know?
Right. This is where they really attack the foundations of modern democracy. The heart of their argument is rejecting the unnatural principle of equality, which has led to the absurd institution of the universal franchise.
Unnatural principle of equality.
Yes. The text flatly states, men are not and never will be equal. And it argues this inequality isn't so much about birth, but about how environment finding out and accentuating minor differentiations of character and ability in the service of society. So for them, the key question becomes, who should govern? The answer is those with specialized knowledge, not just everybody.
And they use some quite pointed examples to argue against everyone having an equal vote, don't they?
They do. The document says it's insulting to tell a sailor that a farm worker's opinion on shipping is as good as his, or the other way around for farming issues. Universal franchise, it claims, makes no allowance for specialized knowledge, but counts all noses alike.
So, their solution.
British Union distinguishes between a seaman and a farmer, a doctor and an engineer, and will not regard their opinions as of equal value upon every subject. Instead, the corporate state extends the vocational principle to politics. They propose an occupational franchise for Parliament.
Meaning you vote based on your job or profession, not where you happen to live.
Exactly that. Members will be elected to represent definite trades and callings. A farmer will vote for a farmer, a miner for a miner, and so forth. Smaller related trades would combine to elect joint members. The text even lists 25 occupational groups, which mirror the economic corporations. We talked about farmers, fishermen, coal miners owners, doctors, lawyers, even housewives, domestic servants.
Housewives and domestic servants get a vote based on their role.
Yes, specifically included. Some groups might have subgroups for more specific representation. The overall aim is a parliament representative of the people, but as a true cross-section, as a functional community, not a cross-section of the windbags of the nation.
This occupational franchise sounds like it would completely dismantle the traditional party system. Was that the intention?
Oh, absolutely. The document says it's completely opposed to the present party system. You wouldn't represent your trade just because you belong to a certain political party. The voter, they argued, would care more about electing someone with sound sense and real knowledge of his occupation than about their political label.
How did they view political parties then?
Very negatively. At best, parties represent only a roughly defined philosophy. At worst, they're just corrupt associations for distributing the spoils of office. A poor instrument of self-government, especially if you're trying to run a planned state.
So, under their system, candidates wouldn't run on party platforms.
No, they'd stand on concrete policy for the industry itself. It would bring forward new men as protagonists of new ideas of industrial and social organization who make their names through constructive administrative work instead of intrigue.
And who gets to vote in this system? What about women?
Anyone with 1 year's standing in the industry gets a vote, employed or not. Voters get a free choice with a vote for each seat available. Employers, directors, managers, etc. vote directly. Shareholders have indirect control through electing directors. And importantly, women will possess equal rights, both as candidates and voters.
Equal rights. And they expected women to get more representation this way.
Yes, they argued women would get special representation where there was a sufficient block of them in an occupation, guaranteeing them much larger permanent representation than under so-called democracy. Particularly, they mentioned for housewives and domestic servants.
And how would voters even know these candidates if constituencies are based on potentially huge industries spread across the country?
The text claims it wouldn't be a problem. Candidates would be a member of the elector's own trade or vocation, probably well known to him by repute. And they could use things like trade papers, the post, meetings at technical centers, and judicious use of the wireless to campaign.
Okay, turning to Parliament itself. The document is pretty harsh about the existing one, calls it hopelessly incompetent. How did the British Union plan to restore Parliament as a useful instrument of government?
Their main strategy was to fundamentally change its job, mostly by reducing the work it is required to do. All those detailed industrial regulations, like the Spindles Bill they mentioned as an example, wouldn't go to Parliament anymore.
Where would they go?
To the self-governing industrial corporations we discussed earlier. They're seen as far more competent to handle that stuff. This frees up Parliament from getting bogged down in pettifogging detail.
So Parliament becomes more of a high-level strategic body.
Exactly. Its very important function would be to decide all general questions. It concerns itself with fundamentals, laying down the principles upon which government and the executive organizations will act. The actual detailed implementation is left to others, with the judiciary making sure it's done properly.
And this occupationally elected House of Commons would be suited for that.
That's the argument. Even if it's not handling the detailed administration, having experts in the Commons would be extremely valuable for understanding the effect of general principles upon particular industries. The example given is, if you're debating public health, the doctors and nurses representatives would speak, and the House would actually listen to the experts on that specific subject.
Rather than just party politics dominating.
Right. Beyond the expertise, the occupational franchise is meant to put an end to the evil system of political parties. MPs could then act as his intelligence and conscience made direct. No more party ties to bring about unsatisfactory compromises and corrupt deals behind the scenes.
So Parliament becomes a true sounding board of public opinion.
That's the goal. Relieved of day-to-day administration, but keeping the authority to set the guiding principles. Procedures would be simplified, and those best qualified to speak on any issue would get preference in debates. This, they claim, would be an immense advantage over the present puppet show at Westminster, with its strings manipulated from the City of London.
Okay, what about the other house, the House of Lords? The document calls it a complete anachronism that lost its way.
It does. It argues the original point of the Lords was actually useful. Great landowners and church leaders advising the king. Land ownership back then implied responsibility towards tenants and a function of service.
But that changed.
It deteriorated, the text says. New lords got appointed often just for donating to political parties, without those old feudal duties. So its prestige declined.
So under British Union, the House of Lords gets scrapped entirely.
Yes, completely replaced by a new chamber of notables, people who've given great service in their own lifetime. Appointments would be made by the crown, but only for life.
Who would be in this new chamber?
Some existing members would stay the spiritual lords, bishops, the law lords, and any landowning peers who were genuine leaders in agriculture locally. But new appointments would look for men of outstanding ability in fields like literature and the arts, the diplomatic service, the defense services, science and invention, medicine and public health, social and public services, a real range of expertise.
And the purpose of this new upper house, it's not just an honor.
No, it's meant to be practical, a way of having expert advice by outstanding men readily available for national administration.
Yeah.
It wouldn't just mirror the Commons, its focus would be different.
How so?
It would concentrate on the cultural, philosophical, and moral aspects of legislation, whereas the Commons would deal more with the primarily material aspects. It would also represent organized cultural and religious bodies not at present considered, leaders of learned societies, local cultural groups, even other religious denominations besides the Church of England.
And specific expertise in certain areas.
Always. It would always include experts in naval, military, air, and foreign affairs, plus representatives from the dominions and colonies for handling imperial matters. These peers would essentially form a panel from which the government could select expert advisors upon any difficult problem. They could attend debates on specific legislation where they had expertise. The aim, again, is to restore the original functions of these institutions and make them vital again.
This whole reorganization goes right to the top then. The British Union government itself would operate differently, with a concentration of authority and responsibility in fewer hands. How would this smaller government work?
Well, remember, a lot of the detailed administration gets pushed down to the self-governing corporations. So many government departments, even whole ministries, could be combined. The document suggests only about a dozen ministers might be needed.
Like who?
Prime Minister, Home Secretary, who'd also cover health and local government, Foreign Secretary, an Imperial Secretary covering dominions, colonies, India, a Minister of Defense, combining Army, Navy, Air Force, a Minister of Corporations, handling all the economic ministries, Minister of Education and Fine Arts, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Lord Chancellor for legal stuff. Much leaner.
And this idea of an inner cabinet seems important too.
Very much so. A small inner cabinet of just 3 or 4 ministers without portfolio, meaning they don't run a specific department, would sit with the Prime Minister. Being free from day-to-day administration allows them to plan national affairs as a whole, gives them time to actually think out the problems.
And decision-making power.
Supreme power rests with this small executive cabinet. They can take a wide view, and the final decisions lie with the PM and this inner council, supposedly unobstructed by administrative red tape. Ministers would automatically be members of both houses of Parliament to maintain contact, but the document rejects the absurd idea that ministers should be chosen only from among members of Parliament. Just being an MP doesn't mean you're qualified to run a ministry, they argue.
Okay, but this raises a big question. If the government is kind of divorced from popular representation in Parliament like this, how does the public actually control it? How do they hold it accountable?
That's a key point. Remember, there are no pro- or anti-government parties in their ideal Parliament. MPs vote on the merits of each case. So accountability works differently. A British Union government would have to submit itself to a direct vote at regular intervals.
A referendum on the government itself.
Yes, at least every 5 years. People vote simply for or against the government. This, the text presents, is the most direct control imaginable.
But what about the argument that such an election wouldn't be fair if there's no organized opposition allowed to campaign against the government?
The document anticipates that criticism,
Hmm.
and it counters it by saying, essentially, we prefer to believe that the British people are quite capable of recognizing a bad government when they experience it, without a lot of interested politicians pointing out its defects to them.
A rather optimistic view of voter perception, perhaps.
Perhaps. It also expresses a preference for continuity of governmental policy rather than the repeated swing of the pendulum between parties. But it does assert that if there was any grave abuse of office, the people could dismiss the government through an adverse vote in this plebiscite.
It's really fascinating, though, that this revolutionary plan put such strong emphasis on a very traditional institution, the crown. What role does the king play in all this?
A surprisingly crucial one. The document explicitly recognizes the traditional dual sources of sovereignty in our national life, king and people. And the king's role becomes vital if the government loses that plebiscite we just discussed.
How?
If the people vote against the government, the crown then assumes responsibility for continuity of government. The king finds new ministers, forms a new government, and then submits that government to another plebiscite. This, they claim, actually places a much greater responsibility upon the crown than does democracy.
And they wanted to bring back some older ideas about the crown and land ownership, too.
Yes, they wanted to restore the good feudal principle that land is held directly or indirectly of the crown for service. They insisted that no land is held in absolute right. Landowners owe a feudal duty of service to the crown and through the crown to the British people.
Service that used to be military but now is.
Now it's economic and will be strictly imposed upon every owner of land. Land ownership becomes a social obligation. Landowners are expected to lead their tenants in using the soil well, manage their estates personally, and actually live among the people they're responsible for.
And if they fail in this duty,
If there's obstruction or failure, the crown will resume occupation of his estates and pass them to some loyal subject or subjects better fitted to administer them in the public interest. It's presented as a traditional control over the uncontrolled ownership of land, which they saw as a dangerous and obstructive monopoly.
any other changes around the crown?
The Privy Council gets abolished, replaced by a Grand Council composed of the leading personalities who have been instrumental in the Great Revolutionary Change, appointed on the advice of the revolutionary leader. The overall effect, the text claims, is the crown regaining a position of leadership and feudal responsibility it has not enjoyed since Charles I was executed by the first democratic parliament of the rapacious merchants of the City of London.
Wow. So given this highly centralized political system and these powerful industrial corporations taking over many functions, what actually happens to traditional local government, councils, mayors, etc.?
The document admits it's a centralized political system, but also stresses the self-government given to the corporations. It concludes that local self-government must eventually be largely superseded by industrial self-government, because the latter is more efficient and in keeping with the specialization of modern knowledge.
Superseded eventually. So what happens in the meantime?
Initially, a British Union government would work through the existing local government bodies. But, it states bluntly, it will never tolerate local authorities dominated in opposition to the party in power at Westminster. They have to toe the line.
So local councils operate but under supervision.
Strict supervision. During the first British Union Parliament, black-shirt MPs would oversee local authorities. They'd ensure personal responsibility will replace anonymous committee management, tracing any mismanagement or obstruction back to specific individuals. This is supposed to help push through great public works on roads and reclamation, rehousing, and town planning.
And after this initial phase, once the occupational franchise is fully in place,
Then the new MPs, elected by occupation, wouldn't be regional anymore. Local administration would shift to officials with grand traditional titles like Lord Lieutenants of counties, who would have considerable responsibilities and powers of local administration. Law and order would become a hierarchy reporting up to the crown, mirroring those feudal principles of land ownership again.
so what's left for the actual local councils to do if most services, roads, utilities, housing, health, are run by the corporations and police and education are centralized?
Their functions become much modified. They'd still exist, perhaps elected by local occupational, cultural, and recreational groups, but mostly as advisory councils. They'd be channels for local opinions and grievances. But their most important remaining role, maybe, would be to encourage local cultural traditions and handicrafts, local sports and amenities, a way to try and counterbalance all the centralization.
The cultural vision, leisure, art, and organic purpose.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time on the economic and political nuts and bolts of this proposed corporate state. It's incredibly detailed, but the document also talks quite a bit about culture, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Specifically sections on the problem of leisure and patronage of art. What was their vision for how people would actually live and express themselves in this new society?
Yeah, it's not just about work and voting. This raises that really interesting question of how a society deals with technological progress and potential abundance. The text predicts that even if they solve unemployment initially, it'll be temporary. Why? Because science endows us with ever-increasing powers of production. Machines will keep displacing labor.
Leading to a superfluity of labor.
Right. But crucially, in a properly organized state, this doesn't mean more unemployment. Instead, it means shortened hours, lengthened education, and earlier retirement. So the problem of unemployment actually becomes transformed into a problem of leisure. What do people do with all this free time?
And the document seems quite critical of how leisure was being used at the time, especially by the wealthy. It warns against just copying them.
Very critical. It dismisses the argument that the rich already had leisure, calling their use of it a crying scandal, that feudal succession of events that constitute the London season. It warns the newly emancipated masses against just imitating these dismal trivialities.
So leisure needs to be organized, managed.
That's exactly it. A serious obligation of the corporate state will be the organization of leisure. Remember those corporations. Each one would be responsible for organizing recreational facilities for its members. They'd pool existing resources, libraries, playing fields, and social clubs supplied by prosperous and progressive firms, and open them up to everyone in that industry.
And the focus seems to be very much on active participation, not just watching entertainment.
Oh, absolutely. The British Union will not be satisfied until every worker has facilities to enjoy his favorite sport and follow his own recreational hobby. It really laments seeing young men watching football instead of playing it, watching horse races instead of training as athletes themselves.
It sees that as a bad sign.
A most ominous sign, it says. It draws a parallel. It is the difference between Greece and Rome, between the athlete and the gladiator. Active participants versus passive spectators. It even invokes the bread and circuses of ancient Rome as a warning, keeping the population distracted and docile.
So physical fitness becomes almost a national duty.
Exactly. The British people must be led back to the playing fields. They must learn that physical fitness, apart from being a pleasure to themselves, is an obligation which they owe to the nation. This vision includes industry-specific sports grounds, swimming pools, inter-industry team competitions.
And it wasn't just about sport, was it? What about other forms of recreation?
Yeah.
And social issues like drinking?
No, not just sport. Less strenuous things like music, dramatics, literature, debate, and indoor games of skill would also be encouraged. It makes an interesting point about pubs, claiming the public house is popular because it is often the only center of social recreation available.
Implying that if you provide better alternatives,
Then, British Union centers of athletic and cultural recreation will complete the process and reduce drunkenness to its pathological minimum. Leisure isn't seen as a curse, but a massive opportunity. But it can't be left to democratic method of anarchy and chaos. It has to be directed by authority into channels that will benefit both state and people, improving physical well-being through ordered athleticism and raising cultural standards through organized recreational activity. It even contrasts this vision with the perceived decadence of Berlin before the Nazis took power.
Now, the document also tackles the criticism that a fascist state would stifle culture, that it's inimical to culture because it restricts artists' freedom. How do they counter that? What's their vision for art?
They basically argue artists already lack freedom in the current commercial age. They're bound, the text says, by the most sordid standard of popular taste, and the only way they can escape is through studied eccentricity to appeal to intellectual snobs. This, they claim, is actually the harshest of tyrannies.
So commercialism is the real tyranny for artists.
That's the argument. True art, it says, is the expression of the spirit of the whole community, or it is nothing but neurotic self-exhibitionism. It's also critical of modern art patronage, saying Philistine majorities are unfitted for this tactful undertaking. It even suggests past aristocrats or wealthy Roman patrons like Maecenas were far more successful than contemporary millionaires, whom it accuses of finding it humiliating and subordinating artists of genius to be the paid servants of the rich.
So the corporate state claims it will actually liberate the artist.
How? That is the claim, yes. The corporate state offers the artist his own honored place in the national life. There would be a special corporation just for artists, giving them self-governing powers to equip and train himself and his fellows. Artists would enjoy special protection and support from the state, aiming to rescue culture from decades of neglect.
And connect the artist more closely with the people.
Yes, fostering a much closer contact between artist and people. Encouraging the masses through reduced prices, special facilities to actually go to concerts, opera, theater, exhibitions, so the artist no longer lives apart as a bohemian rebel, but is integrated into society.
And what about amateur creativity? People making their own art or crafts. Does that fit in?
Very much so. It links back to that organized leisure idea. People would be given every facility to develop their own amateur talents. The document laments that the rise of the machine has ruined handicrafts. British Union would fight this through recreational organizations dedicated to restoring lost handicrafts.
So a distinction between machine production and handcraft.
A clear distinction. The ideal they paint is of a worker tending an automatic shoe machine during the day, then going home to his own last and turn out a handmade pair of shoes as good as any made by medieval craftsmen. It even suggests forbidding the manufacture of any articles of decoration by machine.
Why?
Because machine-produced decoration is killing artistic impulse. Machines are for necessities. Handwork is for art and hobbies. The vision is that no longer will the mantelpieces of the people be adorned with Birmingham-produced presents from Margate, but with the products of the skill of members of the family and their neighbors.
And they conclude this section by rejecting the idea that fascism is anti-culture.
Absolutely. Calling it culture's enemy is absurd, the text says, given what it sees as the hopeless decline of artistic accomplishment throughout the demo-liberal era. It expresses this hope that the revolutionary urge that restores the national spirit of the British people may well recover the Tudor atmosphere that gave us Shakespeare, a return to a perceived golden age.
Okay, finally, the document gets into the really deep philosophy behind all this. It calls the corporate state an organic form through which the nation expresses itself, not just a mere mechanism of administration. This takes us to what they call the organic purpose.
Yes, this is the real philosophical bedrock. The document draws a sharp contrast between fascism and communism. Communism, it says, is just a materialist creed, only caring about the material benefit of the masses. Fascism, on the other hand, is presented as essentially idealistic.
Idealistic in what sense?
In that it recognizes the nation as an organism with a purpose, a life, and means of action transcending those of the individuals of which it is composed. Like a person might sacrifice for their career or a higher goal, the corporate state isn't just about good government, it's the means of self-expression of the nation as a corporate whole in the attainment of its national destiny.
The nation as an organism with a destiny. Does that mean they saw the state as divine in some way?
Interestingly, the text is careful to deny that. This does not involve a claim of divinity for the state. Why? Because the very suggestion of purpose debars any claim to divinity, for the divine is perfect and cannot have a progressive purpose. The state, being a human institution, is actually in grave need of spiritual guidance and must conform to the universal moral law. By condemning the current state, they argue, fascists are judging it by absolute values that transcend all states.
So not divine, but guided by higher moral values. And what about the individual versus the state in this philosophy?
They claim there is no need for any conflict between individual and the state, as neither can exist without the other. Progress comes from finding a true balance between them, which, surprise, surprise, the corporate state's functional organization best achieves.
And this destiny or purpose they talk about, what is it?
Here, the text affects a little becoming modesty. It insists the purpose is not merely preparing the nation for war, claiming sympathy for other nations' legitimate goals, nor is it just about material satisfaction for everyone. That's just a means to an end.
Which is?
A means of releasing the people from sordid material preoccupations to take part in the great adventure. The ultimate goal. To prepare a fitting vehicle for the attainment of that destiny, to give the nation that organic form instinct with life, which will enable it to play its part in the great events of future world history.
Preparing Britain for its great role on the world stage.
Essentially, And it concludes with these historical echoes. It suggests medieval people who lived in hovels and built cathedrals were nearer to a realization of the divine purpose than we are today. And it points again to the Tudor period as the high point of our own national life, finding expression not just in exploration but in philosophy and science, and the poetry and drama of William Shakespeare. The ultimate aim seems to be recovering that perceived age of faith and the vital energy of Tudor England.
So there we have it. We've unpacked this incredibly detailed blueprint for the corporate state as British fascists envisioned it back in 1938, from completely reordering the economy and industry through these corporations,
To creating a parliament based on occupation, not geography.
reviving a powerful role for the crown, and even laying out a cultural vision that redefines leisure and art. It's an incredibly comprehensive and, frankly, quite startling vision for a total transformation of society.
It really is. And what's so fascinating, I think, is that consistent tension running right through the document. It keeps promising individual security, liberation, a better life, but always through giving up traditional individual liberties and democratic ways of doing things.
Security in exchange for freedom, essentially.
That seems to be the trade-off offered. It presents these decisive solutions to what it saw as chaos and economic misery, but the solution is always imposing this rigid, centralized, organic order from the top down, all framed within this idea of a collective national destiny.
And understanding a document like this, it isn't just a history lesson, is it? It's about seeing how these really challenging, sometimes disturbing ideas can be packaged and presented in a compelling way.
Definitely. It's about recognizing how appealing the promise of order and efficiency can become when democracy is seen to be messy or failing.
This deep dive gives us a really powerful case study, I think, in understanding the complete holistic worldview of one particular ideological movement. It lets you get properly informed, quickly, on a topic that carries some profound historical weight and raises big theoretical questions.
Which does leave us with an important question for you, the listener, to maybe think about. In our own time, with all its complexities and information overload, where do you draw the line? The line between wanting efficient organization, wanting things to work, and preserving those individual freedoms.
Yeah, and how might those promises we saw outlined here, order, prosperity, security, how might they appeal to people today, especially in moments when society feels like it's failing or in crisis?
Something to ponder, definitely.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep getting informed.